Reconsider Christ podcast provides real-life examples on how Christ works to interact with our lives. Our guests paint on the canvas of life their stories of joy, heartache, struggle, and victory. You will learn more about the true nature of Christ, for it is time to reconsider Christ. Trust. Dorothy Yang produces a beautiful example of what life looks like when you trust God. As a child, Dorothy was introduced to God while attending children's classes at a church where her mom worked. From that point, God began to slowly reveal himself and Christ to her. Dorothy's childlike trust allowed her to continue building a deeper relationship with God. As life began to throw her curveballs, Dorothy realized God's plan, not her plan, was always better. And this truth has guided Dorothy into adulthood and a successful nonlinear career. After graduating from UC Berkeley, Dorothy worked for Johnson & Johnson and eventually found herself in her current role working on community platforms for Meta. Throughout her varied career, Dorothy has translated her love of God to serving her colleagues with God's love. As parents, you'll be encouraged by the reminder of how God works with your kids. As a person going to work each day, you will be encouraged and given examples to love others as Christ does. Enjoy. Well, hello, Dorothy. It's so good to have you on the Reconsider Christ podcast.
Great to be here.
I really appreciate your time in the middle of the workday. And also, I'm very excited about what we'll be talking about today. Especially when we get to your postgraduate work and some of the things you discovered there. And then just talking about employee resource groups that some of our people might not know about, our audience, and what that means to a Christian in the marketplace. So we got quite a few things to cover today. And thank you again for your time.
Of course, excited to chat through.
Good. So as you know, the first place we start with the podcast is, what kind of home did you grow up in? What was the influence of the home? And did you have an opportunity to get to know Christ during those early years of your life?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that in the initial stages of my life, I was not a person of faith, but my great grandmother was actually a pastor in her village, and my mother was very close to her. So when my mother started working at a church school, it was a part of the job description for her to be on the worship team. And every Sunday, I was in fifth grade at the time, I just tagged along and started to learn about this person, this called God, and this thing called prayer. And I was intrigued and I thought I would try it. I prayed about something small. I don't remember what it was, maybe like an A on a test or something like that. And God answered. So it piqued my interest and I kept wanting to learn more, and got to a point in about maybe sixth or seventh grade when I was considering being baptized. And at that time, I thought that meant, believing in God and believing in prayer. I actually didn't know anything about Jesus. And I went ahead and got baptized. I went to a Lutheran church. So the process was you get baptized and then you get confirmed. And in the confirmation class was actually when I heard about Jesus. And I remember the pastor at the time saying something like, we're all imperfect humans, and God only allows perfect people to go to heaven. And I thought, wait a minute. I thought I was going to heaven as a Christian. I thought that's why I got baptized. Like, what happened? And he said, that is why when Jesus died for us on the cross, he made us perfect so that we can go to heaven. And I think that's when the light bulb moment happened in my head. And I was super grateful. And I think I'm even more grateful. You'll hear this theme as I share more about my story, is that God really rewards childlike faith in my journey. So even though I didn't know about Christ and I got baptized, thought I was a Christian, he still continued to teach me more about him, and then gave me opportunities to learn the full story of the gospel. And yeah, I think those were the early years and how I became to know God and then also know more about who Christ is.
Mm-hmm. You are exactly correct. It's amazing how God takes care of children and children, looking and exploring the faith, and just how he kept laying out the plan for you. That's fascinating. So you go into high school, you're working on your SATs, and you learn there was a secret.
Yes, I did. This is again, God rewarding my childlike faith. I don't know where. I heard somewhere that if you read the King James version of the Bible, it'll help your verbal scores on the SAT because of the vocabulary or something
Mhm.
along those lines. So I started reading the King James version of the Bible, not because anyone told me to, but because I wanted to I wanted to improve my verbal scores.
Mhm.
And then in addition to that, I wandered to the back of the sanctuary one day and picked up these pamphlets called devotionals. And
Yeah.
again, no one told me about them. I just picked them up and I started reading them every day just because I wanted to, and realized that they were always applicable to me. And I just think back to this time because I even donated to them, and I mailed like $1 or $2 in cash because I was so touched by, it was called The Word for You Today. And
Uh-huh.
I really love that devotional. So every day I was reading a devotional and I was reading scriptures without understanding anything about spiritual disciplines. And that's really, again, to say that, God really, pulling me along in the childlike faith
Mhm.
and in my journey.
So I don't know if you'll remember or not, but it'd be fascinating to hear. Do you remember kind of your first thoughts as you were reading through the Bible? Was it confusing? Did it make sense? Were you just studying the words so you know the language, or what?
Yeah, I definitely because it was the King James version, it was definitely confusing. But then it was nice to have the supplemental, stories through Sunday school or the youth group that I went to on Friday nights. So I think that helped. But I do remember I started reading the NIV in college, and something went on in my head where I was like, oh wow, it actually makes sense now. I understand this language. But still, I think, God used all of that to get me to the place where I needed to be in college, because I think, I could have easily fallen away from the faith, but I felt like God kept rewarding me for the little steps I was taking, to get to know more about who he is.
It's fascinating because I see the characteristics of taking responsibility for finding out, yourself,
Yeah.
and exploring. I know you're obviously your mom was supportive for you. Did you have a group of friends around you who were supportive also, or was this kind of a journey you were doing on your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say that I did have some friends in high school who are also people of faith, and we used to have something called prayer at the pole every morning. So it was really great to be encouraged. And I think at the time I didn't realize that this was a community for me. At the time it was just, oh yeah, like friends who share similar interests and similar faith. And I think that
Yeah.
one of the friends, what he really taught me was, and also through circumstances I learned this personally, was that sometimes what we want and what God wants aren't the same, but what
Mhm.
God wants is always better. And I went through several events in high school where I saw where I may have been initially disappointed, but in the longer term, what God had planned was so much better, even though I had missed out on the initial opportunity that I was disappointed by. So I
Can
think
you
that
give
was,
us an example of that?
yeah, sure.
That's a
It's
great lesson to learn in high school. Most people don't get that till they're 60.
okay. I mean, it was a really small thing now to think
Yeah.
about it. I think it was, so in high school, I was very involved with my high school choir.
Mhm.
And I had an opportunity to audition. And I don't know if those of the listeners, whether in different states, if there's something called honor choir, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I had an opportunity to sing at the state level for the honor choir when I was a sophomore, but I didn't go because it was too far away. And I had another opportunity in senior year, but I was not able to audition that year.
Oh.
Sorry, it was junior year. I was not able to audition because it conflicted. We're going to talk about SATs again, and conflicted with my SATs date. and they would not allow me to reschedule. And I was really, really
Wow.
disappointed by that. And I didn't understand, because that year they switched the location. So that year it would have been closer to home. So I definitely would have been able to go. So I was really disappointed because, something at the state level felt big in high school.
Yeah.
Um, so then, the event of the honor choir concert happened in the spring. The audition was in the fall. And in the spring, the date of the concert happened to be on the same date that I also played violin. So I was taking a very important like violin exam on that same day. And so I realized had I made it to that honor choir, I wouldn't have been able to take that violin exam.
Mhm.
So again, really small thing, but ultimately made me realize, wow, like God had a plan all along. I didn't know it back in October when I had to audition. I was really disappointed, but it was a
Mhm.
really good lesson that, there's no way I could have made that violin exam if I, tried out for the honor choir and made it. And I think that violin exam is something that I had been preparing for years for.
Wow.
So ultimately, it was more important that I was there for that exam
Mhm.
than maybe the honor choir. So I think, again, it's a very small thing, but it definitely showed me that sometimes we might be disappointed, but God has a greater plan and always works out for the best in his plan in the end.
Very well stated. It's really interesting that you would learn that at such an early age. So obviously you did great on your SAT and you took violin and honor choir. You had all these extracurricular activities. So every school wanted you. So you went off to college. Where'd you head off to?
Yeah, actually, let's talk about that a little bit. I
Okay.
actually didn't get into the schools that I really wanted to get into,
Oh.
and this is another God's planning thing.
Uh-huh.
I had wanted to, go to this Harvard and Stanfords of the world. I didn't make it,
Mhm.
but God gave me a full ride to go to Berkeley.
Oh.
And so again, it was not what I had planned for myself. But and once I got to Berkeley, I realized it was such a good fit for me as a person. Um, it's in a more urban environment, so I could
Mhm.
walk around everywhere. I could take public transportation. I could have a car, but I didn't need one. And I loved that. And that's actually why I wanted to go to the East Coast for school, because I wanted to, be in New York, be in Boston. And I felt like Berkeley was a miniature version of that on the West Coast.
Mhm.
It was just enough from home to be independent, but not too far because my parents were in Southern California.
Mhm.
And then it's one of the top programs, which I didn't even know at the time, but it's some of the top programs for my major, which is chemical engineering.
Mhm.
And then on top of that, I loved the weather. I know some people might think it's too cold, but I feel like it's just perfect weather here in the Bay Area for
Yeah.
me.
Mhm.
And also the most important part is I grew so much spiritually during college. And that's
Mhm.
not what you would immediately think when you think about Berkeley. I think a lot of
Mhm.
people warn me about going to Berkeley because it's like, oh, it's a, really liberal place and it's filled with lots of, bad ideas or something like that. But
Yeah.
actually there was such a great group of Christians there, and I learned, you know, what it means to have spiritual disciplines. And I learned the true definition of community through the fellowship that I was a part of, the churches that I was a part of. So it was
Mhm.
very much, life changing experiences there. And I feel like that's definitely something God had planned for me. And, he also provided the means for me to afford to go to Berkeley so that my parents wouldn't have to worry about paying for me.
The thing you said, and when we had talked earlier that I really picked up on, is you
Mhm.
found this to be a place of great spiritual growth for you.
That's
So,
right.
kind of start me through. I assume you got on campus and you started searching out some other Christians, or walk me through that process and how you started getting connected in the community.
I'm smiling because I think I'm going to make you and maybe some listeners laugh. I actually looked for fellowships before I got there. That's how
Really?
much God was preparing me.
Wow.
I think, reflecting back, the last year of high school was really hard for me. And I
Hmm.
think that I was really looking to start something new. And again, thinking back, I didn't have to look for fellowship. So it's definitely something, a desire that God placed in my heart. I was so excited to look for fellowships. So I had targeted which ones I was interested in before I even got on campus. And
Hmm.
when I got there, I checked out a lot of different ones and actually had a really hard time deciding which one to go with because there were so many wonderful ones that I had
Hmm.
found. And
Hmm.
ultimately, I ended up going with Crew
Yeah.
because we had such a great group of women in my freshman class, and we just all came from different walks of life. And again, I really learned the meaning of community through, studying the Bible with them, just like living life with them, because we all lived really close to each other in the dorms. And then, learning about things like praying, doing quiet time. Those are never things that were really taught to me as I was,
Right.
going through church. So yeah, it was really great to learn those types of spiritual disciplines. We also had things like, I think we prayed and fasted for a period of time as a fellowship for revival for our campus, where we would come and pray at different points in the campus and do prayer walks. And I think yeah, again, just felt so much growth for me spiritually there that I didn't want to go home because anytime I went home, I felt spiritually dry and really missing that type of community and growth.
Yes, yes, I understand that feeling very much. So let's do a little compare and contrast here.
Sure.
So towards the end of high school, your concepts and ideas about God and Christ and how that began to change in college.
Yeah, I think that the difference is really it sounds cliche, but I think my relationship with God definitely deepened and became more personal in college. I think I was maybe on a little bit more surface level, besides some of those events I mentioned where I learned that, what I want may not always be what God wants, and ultimately what God wants is better. I think in college, because I was meeting with God so regularly, I felt really close to him. And, I remember I would read the Bible every day and like write out verses that really stuck out to me. And I think because of that, the person that I was in college was also someone that I still admire to this day. Because sometimes I'm like, oh, I miss that girl who was in
Yeah,
college.
yeah.
And I think it also bore fruit in ways that I didn't expect. Like I really felt convicted to minister to my classmates and those people who are around me versus the typical path for a college fellowship is you kind of rise in leadership in your fellowship. And I didn't feel like that was the path for me. I felt
Mhm,
more called to the people I was doing homework with daily or the people I was studying with.
mhm.
And that we were able to have some, focus groups my senior year or junior and senior year, where we were able to have deeper conversations. And I think all of those things helped me better understand the heart of God. I don't think I ever really thought about evangelism in high school, or really understood what it looked like. And when I say evangelism, it's not just about, like holding a sign or talking to people
Mhm.
during a specific period of time. I think it was really being open about my faith, but also like living out my faith. And I very much felt that in college. And I very much felt convicted to minister to those around me.
Mhm, mhm. Fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. There's several things just fire off my brain. How your relationship in Christ grew and in God at Berkeley, which, as you said, was not known to be a great place of Christian growth. Obviously a great Christian community, and people were driving you. I mean, to experience the spiritual disciplines. Obviously takes an extreme amount of discipline, but also you're studying to be a chemical engineer. I think you have to go to more than one class a day while you're doing that. And there's labs and intense reading. So
Oh, yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing the discipline you had to squeeze all that in during those college days.
I mean, I'll be honest, there was a period of time where I thought about switching my major. And I think that's
Mhm,
also an arc in my story as well, in terms of how God worked, because I didn't do well my first year and a half of college. And
oh,
I
mhm,
thought, well, if this is my major, I should be doing well. But something to know about Berkeley is that sometimes they have weeder classes, especially in the beginning. So they make things extra hard. So to weed out those who are not serious about something.
Right.
And I seriously considered changing my major, but I think that through a lot of prayer and fasting and also prayers from other people, I decided to stick it out. And I'm so glad I did, because God made me see that in this big university, I was in a major of something like 200 people, my class, which is very small in comparison, that I was uniquely positioned to be, a person of peace, or like a witness there. So I feel like I learned a lot, and it was challenging in the beginning, but I got into a rhythm of, I was scheduling my days by the hour to be able to
Wow.
fit everything in.
Right.
But yeah, God provided. And, by the end, I couldn't have imagined studying anything else. And I was so close to my classmates because we're such a small major. So I was really grateful for even the non-spiritual community I had through my classmates.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Excellent. And you talk about the idea of ministering to others and serving others. And you obviously came about this in a very organic and natural way. When you use those words, what did that mean? How were you ministering to students on the campus?
Yeah, so I think sometimes it could be really small things, getting to know them on a deeper level. I think something that other people have told me is that I ask good questions. And
Mm-hmm.
so I like to ask questions where I get to know people better. But I'll say that sometimes it requires me opening up first to share something vulnerable about me to then get to know someone better. So I knew things about my classmates, about, like what was going on in their family. And if there were challenges, that's an opportunity for me to say, like, hey, can I pray for you? And if they're not comfortable, like in front of them, I just pray by myself. So I think that's something. And then I briefly mentioned this, but we started, I prayed for God to send me a partner in ministry, and he did. My junior year, my friend Amy and I started something called a focus group, where every week we would talk about deeper topics like, is there a heaven and hell? Is there a God? And I think through that, we also got to know our classmates. And then the other way to minister is, oftentimes it's really funny. I actually didn't think I was one of the smartest people in our class, but for some reason, other people thought I was. But I think that's because I went to all of the office hours to like get
Right.
answers and like get help on my homework. So sometimes I would share that information with my classmates. And then the other part of it is maybe being, again, this is super simple, but just being friendly. We had superlatives at the end of our 4 years, and I think I was voted most popular or something like that. All that is to say is just, I would introduce myself to people. I would say hi. I don't ever like to see people excluded. So if I saw someone excluded, I would make sure that they were included in some way. And I tried to be consistent in that, whether it was, with my classmates, whether it's with the lunch lady I came to befriend and like know all 4 years. Her name is Maria. I still think of her to this day. Or the people I worked with. I worked in a lab also, and those people were, graduate students, much older. I try to make sure I was consistent in who I was and trying to live like Jesus would as much as I could.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Again, I would have to come up with a new word, and I've already used amazing. So I'll just say, just well done. How about that? Just well done. I love your definitions of what you were doing with and for other people, because that's really, if you go to the New Testament, you see that time and time again, give the cup of water, help the orphan, just pay attention to what's going on around you. And you became Miss Popular by vote and declaration. And yet in doing so, you were an outlier. You're in a small major, a
Yeah.
small field of chemical engineering. You were a Christian on what most people would think is an atheistic campus.
Right.
And yet people saw this light in you that represented acceptance and love and appreciation for these other people. So very well done. Talk to me quickly about the spiritual disciplines that you were participating in and how they helped you grow your faith and your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So definitely read the Bible every day. And it could be, I'll say I maybe it wasn't always at the same time each day, but I literally remember sitting in I was sitting in the math library and reading my Bible. And then I had a journal of all the different verses that stuck out to me every day. And I think that was really helpful for me to kind of not just read it, but then like reflect on like, oh, what of these words that I'm reading really stand out, and how is God speaking to me through that? And then also I did for a period of time fasting, and I tried different forms of fasting. So sometimes it was from food, sometimes it was from electronic devices, and that was really helpful for me to just be centered. And then we also did community events. So whether it was community prayer, which I thought was really important for me to participate in, because we would wake up early in the morning and pray by what we called, it's a clock tower. We called the Campanile.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think those were probably some of the main ones. Yeah, prayer,
Mhm.
reading scripture, writing it down, and then when I had time, I would also journal. And on retreats, I might like memorize verses, and that was always really impactful for me too.
Mhm. Mhm. And what's fascinating, there I go, using fascinated again. What I really appreciate what you're saying is it was just natural, it was just organic.
Yeah.
And I can see how those days in college really prepared you for your career and what you're doing and the way you reach out to that. So, chemical engineer, you go basically into the healthcare area
Yep.
and start mixing compounds and all sorts of things. So, creating compounds. So, tell us about those first few years in your work and career, and then get to the point where you talked about, when we talked earlier about your dissatisfaction, and then you couldn't really find the job you wanted and you went to a completely different industry. and
Yeah,
and I
sure.
love a quote. I actually have it written down and I want to um, read it because I would like for you to, I know you'll tie it in, but uh, oh, a non-linear career makes sense to God. You don't have to
Mhm.
convince me of that. That's good enough. All right,
Sure.
take off on any directions there that I gave you.
Yeah, so I started my career through a leadership development program with Johnson and Johnson. And I
Mhm.
think what most people don't know is that Johnson and Johnson doesn't just make consumer products like baby powder. They also make medical devices as well as
Mhm.
medicines, like cancer drugs, for example. So my leadership development program took me to different sectors within Johnson and Johnson, different functions. So I started in chemical engineering, and or what we called process engineering, but also did supply chain planning as well as manufacturing and lean and Six Sigma type of work. And I got to travel around the country and in different types of roles. And I think those first 2 years, it was again, how do I be a witness where I am? And in particular, I think of my time in Pennsylvania really fondly because I worked on the manufacturing floor, and very similar to what I shared in terms of what I did in college, got to know the people really well, like ate lunch with the people I worked with, actually started a prayer group with some of the people who work on the manufacturing line, which was so encouraging to me.
Mhm.
um, and yeah, and at the end of that, one of the biggest compliments of that was a lot of people told me that they hope they work for me someday. And this is like when I was 23. So that's a
He said,
huge
sure,
compliment,
look forward to it.
a huge compliment coming from
Yes.
people who are decades older than me. And then also they gave me like $50 in cash, which I knew some of them were struggling financially. So it meant a lot to me that they gathered their resources together to give me a gift.
Mhm.
And then so worked in healthcare. So went back to Neutrogena, which is on the LA, which is in California, and it's still a Johnson Johnson company. And what happened was I encountered some events in my life where I realized our healthcare system is really broken. And, drugs are really expensive. The hospital is not necessarily run efficiently. Um, what can I do? I'm an engineer by training. I like to solve problems. This sounds like a really complicated problem. What can I do about that? So
Mhm.
I went back to school and got my MBA and Master of Public Health, and then um, sort of pivoted from engineering and operations to more product strategy and innovation types of roles, and spent after school about 4 or so years at Kaiser Permanente, which is a large health system, which also includes an insurance arm here in California, and there's some other regions across the country. And got to a point where I really enjoyed the work, but felt like I was not necessarily always valued in the role that I was in. So I felt like I needed to make a career change and started job searching. But it took a lot longer than I expected. Going back to God always has a plan, I started seeing a lot of closed doors in that job search that just didn't make sense. So, someone told me that, and I would always make it to final rounds only to be told that I didn't get it. Um, I would be told, we're not sure that you're passionate about healthcare. I mean, my entire career is about healthcare. So that was just really confusing to me. Or something would happen with the hiring manager would leave all of a sudden and the role would be closed. Or I had a verbal offer then that was rescinded. And finally, about
But
almost
let's
2 years.
let's
Yeah, go
stop
ahead.
right there. So that was 2 years. So what are you and God talking about during this time? Like, hey, God, what's up?
Well, I mean, I think after a while, I was like, okay, God, I guess I'm not supposed to move. Like, I feel like maybe there was something I needed to do at Kaiser before leaving. So then I was like, okay, God, I will stay. Or I started thinking also about like, well, maybe it's not supposed to be another job. Um, maybe there are other things that I can work on in addition to my main job that would still satisfy what the ideal life I was looking for. Because that's one of the other things I talk about is like, it's not about the dream job. It's about like what kind of dream life you want and how does the job fit into that.
Mhm,
Because your life shouldn't be all about your job. So,
mhm.
so yeah, I think God oftentimes when you kind of let go is when he makes things happen. So I think at the point I was like, okay, God, maybe I'm not supposed to be looking for another job. So you take the lead and I'll keep doing what I'm doing. And if something comes up, great. So about 2 years in, I finally get an official offer. And I'm supposed to respond on a Friday. And it's like Wednesday, and I'm like, yes, I'm so excited. I'm going to, accept this offer. I'm looking forward to this new role. It's with a company I really admire. And on Thursday, something just shifts in my spirit.
Huh.
And I was like, you know what? I'm not supposed to take this job. And I cannot explain it. I just and on Friday, I told the team that I wasn't going to take the offer. I went back to my room and I cried my eyes out because it didn't make any sense to me. And I felt like the most foolish person in the world, because here was my first offer in 2 years. And here I was just like saying no to it and without any reason. But right around that time, that Wednesday night was when the recruiter from then Facebook, now Meta, reached out and said, hey, we have a role on, our faith partnerships team. Are you interested? And I thought, okay, well, I'll see what happens. And of course, she didn't have any time to talk before my decision about the other job.
Of course.
Right. So then I was like, okay. And anyway, I made the decision to just give up the other job without talking to her first. And then, long story short, exactly a month after I rejected that first job, I got the offer to the job that eventually led to where I am now. And again, non-linear career. I've spent my whole career in healthcare. Now I work in tech, and not exactly related to healthcare, but still very much focused on social impact as a part of the broader community partnerships team here at Meta. But that's definitely a God planned circumstance, because I could have never planned it for myself. And going back to, you were asking me what I was doing those 2 years, like my verse of those 2 years was from Ephesians 3:20. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine. And I felt like that was it. That's not something I could have imagined for myself. I didn't even know that team existed at Meta. So very much just how God shaped that journey, even though, yeah, those 2 years were hard. I'm not used to it taking that long to find something, but ultimately it was God's plan. And going back to what I said back, about those high school days, we know that God has great plans for us, and it's better than what I would have planned for myself. So,
How do you feel when you stop and you look back at this puzzle and the way it all fit together? Because, I just see so many correlations that put you exactly where you are now with community partnerships, faith partnerships. It's just fascinating. So kind of, how does that make you feel when you look back at that puzzle?
yeah, and I think that's what I meant when I said, like, non-linear career paths don't make sense to the average, not average, just like humans in general. And I think that's
Mhm.
partially why I wasn't getting jobs, because my career path is non-linear, and a lot of recruiters don't know what to do with me
Right.
unless they're more seasoned and can sort of piece together all of the different connections. And yeah, I'm super grateful, because when I first came to this role, I thought, this is a new industry, it's a new type of function, it's going to be a huge learning curve. But actually, I found it was a lot it was a lot more smooth than I expected it to be,
Mhm.
because I had a ton of transferable skills. And in my last job, I built something from scratch, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. And it's
Mhm.
something I love to do, even with all the challenges that come with that.
Mhm.
So I just felt like God really knew what my strengths are, and was able to put me in a place to be able to showcase them. So
Mhm.
super grateful, and for all the themes that tie together.
So let's talk a little bit about employee resource groups. You being at Meta are part of a very active and large one. Uh, just give us a quick definition of what a faith-based Christian uh, employee resource group is, and then how has it impacted your career?
Yeah, so I think, it's probably different in each company, but in a very short summary, an employee resource group is, in the faith-based sense, is a group of people who share the same faith and want to encourage each other in the workplace. And so, how it's affected me is that I have it's been really an encouragement and a pleasure to be a part of our Christian group at Meta. There's prayer meetings, there's worship sessions. We've had the privilege of hearing from some really well-known speakers and pastors. And that's always been really encouraging, especially, when you're in the middle of a workday. It's always good to be brought back to what centers us. So I
Mhm.
think for me, that's been really helpful. And then also finding like-minded believers in, especially in tech, where maybe not a lot of people of faith, has always been really helpful. And then we've also tried to like find ways to encourage each other and help each other on projects as well. So that's been really encouraging for me.
Yeah. And when do you usually meet? And it sounds like you're probably meeting virtually and not as a large group, obviously.
Yeah, so Meta is really big. So the group is really big. And there are weekly prayer meetings. And then there are also, it depends on, we even have like location-based groups. So there are
Mhm.
certain locations that might be doing a Bible study on a regular basis. Because we have such a large group, there's a lot of things happening. So if you can think of it's in some ways it's almost like a college fellowship, but within the context of a company. And so there's a lot of events happening all the time, and you get to, yeah, we have the privilege of choosing, what might make the most sense and what we might want to commit to. And then I also want to, really thank the people who are leading our Christian ERG at Meta, because they spend a lot of time thinking through how to design the best programming and the best types of events to help our community.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, you've talked about all the good experiences you've had in expressing your faith in a what most would call a hostile college environment. In your career, some of these companies have been known for their character; other companies have not been. When are times that you've had some pushback? Say, Dorothy, kind of pipe it down a little bit, will you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that anyone has told me that directly, because I'd like to think I have a very strategic and tactful approach to how I share about my faith. So I'm not someone who is like shouting at the top of my lungs, but I'm also not shy about my faith. So I'll tell people that I go to church on Sundays and things like that. I think the one experience I can think of, there was someone who, I think I told this person that I was attending some, faith related event. And there was a comment about like, oh, well, that's just dumb that you're doing that. So I think that's probably the one experience I can think of. And at the time it was hurtful because I care a lot about whatever it was that I was going to. But at the end of the day, I realized like, he's entitled to his opinion, and we can agree to disagree, and that's okay. And he knows who I am as a person, and that's what's most important. And it's okay that he feels that way now, but what I can do is pray for him, and maybe he will have a different perspective somewhere down the line. And I will actually say, we're not close friends to this day, but we're definitely not enemies. And I check in on this person, and we actually, when we graduated, were very supportive of each other's careers and very much respectful of each other. So I think even though that was one comment, and I think that he at some point explored Christianity, but this is a good reminder for me to check in with him to see how he's doing.
Well, thank you. Your life has shown that you can be faithful and do it in a way that draws respect and consideration from others, and for respect and consideration of Jesus and God. So very well done. And I appreciate the things that you've had to say today, and your scripture is just very encouraging. I know our audience is going to love you. So thank you so much for your time today, Dorothy.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks so much for having me.